welcome to this year's first holiday painting. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, with a large damp square-headed brush. Here I'm using some titanium white, and I'm applying it to the bottom of our horizon. Then I'm slowly beginning to blend it up, as you can see here. Then I'm going to go back to my palette, and I'm going to grab a pink. This is simply a mixture of that same titanium white and a primary red. As you can see, I'm blending the two together, and I'm able to get such a smooth blend because the brush is fairly damp and it's preserving the wet life of the paint. Then I'm going to begin moving upwards in the sky in the same way that I did with the initial application of the white pigment. So here, as you can see, we're just kind of dragging it up, and then once we get to that 2/3 point, I'm going back to my palette, I'm grabbing a mixture of titanium white and primary blue, and I'm beginning to apply that to the sky. I'm blending it into the pink, but I'm doing so fairly softly, and I'm trying to allow the pink to remain a little bit strokey. I want there to be a little bit of movement in the sky as well. You can do this with a very soft and subtle blend, one that is very much void of these brush strokes or movements, and you get something a little bit more calm, but by incorporating this, it does look just a little bit more dynamic and interesting. So it's entirely based on the aesthetic that you personally want to render in the painting. Neither way is necessarily right or wrong. Then I'm going back up to the top and I'm adding some additional blue. Now I'd also like to note that if you have a ultramarine blue, it could be a fantastic substitute for primary blue in this painting because that blue is a little bit warmer, it's a little bit more purpley, and it'll go quite well with the pink. With that said, we're just continuing to blend the sky here, as you can see, and I'm going back over a lot of it with a very soft application of the brush to smooth out any highly noticeable streaks or movements. Then I'm getting some additional titanium white, I'm going and I'm applying that to the bottom of the snow, and then I'm going to kind of mirror my process that I did in the top. So I started with the titanium white, then I grabbed some of our pink and I began to apply that on top, and now I'm getting that mirrored reflection of all of those colors on the sky on the snow down below as well. So it's important to recognize that whatever you're painting, it's going to have some level of reflectivity. And snow is especially reflective, so whatever you're using in the sky, it's important to remember to incorporate at least some of that down into the snow. With that said, I'm now switching over to a rake brush, and for those of you who are unaware, a rake brush is simply a regular square-headed brush or something akin to that, but it has just a myriad of different pieces that kind of are interjected upwards. So, when you make a single stroke, you actually make a plethora of different strokes, and it saves a lot of time. You can buy these at your local art store like Michael's, or you can make your own. I actually made this one. There is a lesson on my channel if you search for that. With that being said, I'm just kind of incorporating some trees here in the background. I started with some blue ones, and then as I get closer up, I get them to be a little bit darker, a little bit more noticeable. And that's because as things get closer to us, we recognize a lot more detail in them. If you want to instigate a lot of depth in your painting, make your background a little bit blurry, make your background a little bit softer, less detail. And as you move closer to us, then begin to instigate a little bit more of that. Now here I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush, and I'm incorporating some additional little details into the trees with a bit of a tapping motion. I'm being very loose with it because I want to ensure that none of the trees are the same and that they're always evolving. I'm also only doing this to the trees that are very much in the foreground, as the ones in the background will be too far away to really notice that sort of thing. Then I'm grabbing a good amount of primary red paint, and I'm going to begin painting in our little building here. It'll be a nice warm building, it will complement the rest of the painting well, it'll stand out, and I think it'll just give us more of that atmosphere that we're really looking for. Now, I did lose a little bit of a clip there, I do apologize, but we just kind of finished that off by adding a triangle to the top of the front of our building. Now I'm adding the roof with some Mars black paint, and it's also worth noting that we're using this smaller square-headed brush because it can hold a good amount of paint, and it does have those very sharp edges, which is fantastic for working on subjects that also have very sharp edges. Then I'm taking a tiny bit of that black, I'm adding that into the side of the house here that's not going to be receiving light, and that way it's a little bit darker and it makes the house look a lot more three-dimensional. Then I'm grabbing some of that blue that we were using, some of the titanium white, and I'm painting in a very small river. Then I'm quickly grabbing my medium-sized square-headed brush, and here I have a bit of a green on it. This is a mixture of primary blue, a bit of primary yellow, and a little bit of titanium white. And here, as you can see, I'm just mapping in my larger tree. At the tops of the tree, you want the pieces to be moving upwards, and then as you get to the middle of the tree, they should kind of be moving out to the side, and then as they get to the bottom of the tree, they get very heavy, and so they're weighed down, and you want them to be kind of swooping down, kind of a bell shape. Maybe the ends of them flip back up. But I'm continuously being very loose with this. Again, I'm trying to ensure that no two branches are the same. I'm leaving openings in the tree, and that's really how you're going to get a much more interesting, realistic tree. So that's also heavily worth noting. Now I'm going back in and I'm filling in some additional areas as well. Now, if you have a little bit of additional time, I do recommend using a smaller square-headed brush for that portion, as I am here with the smaller tree, because realistically, the more detail you can incorporate in the foreground, the better. Remember, the background should be a little bit more blurry, a little bit more impressionistic. You should get an implication of what the subject is. But in the foreground, you really want to work with the fine details, the things that really look real, and it's going to push the depth in your painting so substantially. Now here you can see that I'm actually touching up the larger tree with that smaller square-headed brush as well, and sometimes I just use the corner of the square-headed brush because it's a very fine tip. Now I'm switching back over to the medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm just kind of expanding the river area that I made as well, the ice over there. And sometimes you kind of work on something in your painting like the tree, and you look at the size and the scale, and you look at it in relation to everything else, and you say, you know what, I need to go back and fix this or that. And I think that's just a perfect example. Now, we need to let the painting dry entirely before we move on to this step, so make sure that it is 100% dry. But then I'm going back into the painting with a medium-sized round-headed brush. I'm using a lot of water, I'm using some titanium white with a hint of pink, and I'm beginning to paint on this mist, this snow that's kind of blowing around, and as you can see, I'm covering portions of the house to kind of push it farther in the background. The red was incredibly stark. This is an easy way of toning it down, and it's also an easy way of kind of connecting the trees in the background to the house and then into the foreground, as you can see here. I'm applying this much like I'd apply clouds in a round shape, and I'm allowing the middle portions of the snow that's blowing to be much more dense, and then it gets much more clear as we get towards the edges, so I get a lot softer with the application there. We're also using a good amount of water through that so that it is fairly transparent. Then I'm moving over to my tree and I'm beginning to apply snow to the tops, and only the tops of these branches, areas where snow can actually accumulate. So as you can see here, I'm being fairly loose with it in the same way that I was with the initial application of the trees themselves, and I'm just trying to find areas that I think snow could fall on. Again, much like the tree itself, the top areas, I'm applying it to the tops. And then as we get towards the bottom, when there are these really large overstretching branches, there are going to be areas at the tops of the branches that aren't going to be able to be receiving snow because there are branches on top. So there I'm kind of applying it to the ends. So the technique changes a little bit as you progress through the Christmas tree, but it's a similar application style. And I'm going back and I'm reapplying some of the areas because acrylics are innately fairly transparent, and sometimes we need to go back in and do additional layers and add some thickness. So that's essentially what I'm doing there. I was using the smaller round-headed brush because it does give me a bit of a softer aesthetic, and then I'm grabbing that same brush, I'm adding a lot of water to it, I'm getting some titanium white, I'm peeling back the bristles, and I'm launching some paint here at the canvas. And this is generally great for stars, but in this scenario here, it's fantastic for rendering snow, as you can see. So I'm going back and doing this a good number of times, and I think that it just gets better and better the more we do it here. So sometimes you also end up with little clusters. Don't worry, that's not a bad thing. Sometimes that's how snow falls, and it makes it a little bit more interesting, I think. Now, with that said, that is essentially our 10-minute painting, but as per usual, I do like to give you a couple of extra ideas, so I sped this up and I thought I'd show you how to incorporate some lights in your building. Here I'm taking a titanium white, a primary yellow, I'm throwing in a couple of lights, but then I'm adding a tiny bit of a reflection in the snow and then in the ice, and that's why we incorporated the ice, to bring that out. With that said, that is essentially our 10 to 11-ish minute painting. I truly hope you enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. And if you like hour-long lessons just like this, where I show you my color palettes when we're mixing with water, all of the things we don't generally have time for, there is a link to that in the description as well. Thank you so much for watching. I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. And above all, as always, stay creative.